I am glad to be here with you today in this week. I appreciate the elders here at Rolling Hills for inviting me to be a part of your activities and your Bible studies and your worship this week. We are looking forward to the week together. It's nice to be back in Kentucky. I love Michigan summers. We rarely get above 85. But as far as year-round weather, you can't beat North Central Kentucky. So it's a nice place to be. And it's good to be among brethren. There's not too many places around the country where you have the unity among the churches of the Lord as you have here in this area. And so it's nice to be back in this fellowship. And for those of you who are visiting today from other congregations, thank you for joining us. I presented the elders and Danny and Jerry different options for a series of lessons, and they chose this one, the Bible and Mental Health. But I wanted some lessons to be textual studies, and so for today, the Men's Day, we will have a textual study from the book of Habakkuk. So I encourage you to turn in your copy of God's Word to the minor prophet Habakkuk, and we will spend the whole day, well, half a day, studying Habakkuk. 3 hours, 3 chapters. So we will deal with these 3 chapters. The Occupy Wall Street movement, Black Lives Matter movement, the Tea Party movement. What do all of these movements have in common? Justice. These movements, from whatever perspective, sees some aspect of the American economy or situation or culture as being not fair. Now, we might disagree with their definition of justice, but the deal is that they want fairness. They want the world to be fair. On a personal level, we sometimes ask God where His fairness is. Where is God's justice? Why do evil people get away with wickedness? Why does a Christian have trouble getting pregnant when non-Christians pop out children like a Pez dispenser? Why does a Christian have to experience the pain of divorce when he or she is doing everything they can to have a Christian marriage? Why do Christians get horrible, even incurable diseases when they are trying to live right, when they love Jesus? When your love for Jesus and your concept of justice collide, what do you do? What do you do when you question God's justice? That's the very issue that the prophet Habakkuk is dealing with himself. Habakkuk lived around 600 BC, so 600 years before Jesus comes, before the nation of Babylon will invade, march against, and destroy the city of Jerusalem. And that's going to happen about 15 years in the future from Habakkuk's standpoint. Now, Habakkuk doesn't know that's going to happen yet. We're going to see in just a moment that God tells him that's what's going to happen. But Habakkuk doesn't know that. But he asks God about His justice. Where is your fairness? And what happens when justice is perverted? So I want us to step back in time, in the time that we have this morning as men. Step back in time 26 centuries ago and look at Habakkuk's message and see what happens when you question God's justice. What do you do? Let's look at the text. Chapter 1, verse 1. The prophet Habakkuk says, the oracle which Habakkuk the prophet saw. This word oracle is a word that literally means a burden. It means something that you have to carry or that you sit on top of a mule. It is something heavy. In fact, the verb that gives us this word burden or oracle, depending on your translation, it means to carry. And the noun came to be used for something that had to be carried, and among the prophets, it came to be used as a burden, a message, a prophetic message that had to be carried from the mind of God to the heart of man. Now, in this particular case, you'll see where Habakkuk says this is an oracle, a burden which he saw. So this is a vision that Habakkuk sees, and he sees in this vision himself talking to God. Chapter 1, verse 1, chapter 3, verse 1 are the only times in the Bible where the name Habakkuk is found, which means we don't know anything about Habakkuk outside of these 3 chapters, and we do not know much at all about him as a person. But we do know that he has some questions for God. And as we study through, we're going to see that the word burden fits Habakkuk's message appropriately because he questions the justice of God. Verse 2, "How long, O Lord, will I call for your help, and you will not hear? I cry out to you violence, and yet you do not save." I imagine you and I would have a problem saying those words to God. But Habakkuk does not. Out of the 19 times that the verb call for help is used, 8 times are used in the book of Psalms. 7 times are used in the book of Job. How long, O Lord, will you not help? Habakkuk is certainly not alone in calling on God for help. Here he calls on God for help, praying, and he doesn't feel that God is responding to his prayer. Have you ever felt like God is not listening to your prayers? That's Habakkuk. Just like the Syrophoenician woman in Mark chapter 7, who continually came to Jesus on regularly saying, "Cast this spirit out of my daughter." And Jesus wouldn't do it. Not at first. The verbs in that context suggest that she made repeated requests to Jesus to cast out that spirit, and Jesus was repeatedly saying no until he came to the point where he said, "Okay, I'll do it." And yet the Syrophoenician woman is talking to Jesus face to face. Here Habakkuk is talking to God in prayer, and he cries out, "Violence!" But he does not feel like God is answering his prayer and saving his people. Verse 2 says that Habakkuk cries out because he sees violence around him or wrong. And he will share shortly more about what he saw that was wrong when he looked around him. He sees this wrong and he does not see justice. So verse 3, "Why do you make me see iniquity and cause me to look on wickedness? Yes, destruction and violence are before me. Strife exists and contention arises." What else does Habakkuk see here? He sees iniquity. This word is used a lot of times in the Old Testament as a synonym, of course, for sin. It carries the idea of injustice. Habakkuk is going to refer to this iniquity again in chapter 3 and verse 7. So people are living under the heavy burden of sin, of iniquity. Habakkuk sees wickedness around him. He sees harm around him. People are being harmed by one another. Destruction, he says, or oppression as well as violence are around him. And not only that, he says, but men's hearts are not right. Look at the words he uses. Strife and contention have arisen among Habakkuk's people. Arguing, brawling, quarreling. People's hearts are not in tune with each other. But not out of all of these words used of the trauma Habakkuk is experiencing, he uses the word violence more than any other in his preaching. What is going on? Look at verse 4. "Therefore the law is ignored, and justice is never upheld. For the wicked surround the righteous, and therefore justice comes out perverted." On account of the behavior of his people, and remember this is God's people, these are not unbelievers, these are God's people. And Habakkuk says the law is ignored. Now literally that word ignored, I'm using the New American Standard Version, that word ignored literally means has grown cold. The law of the Lord has grown cold. Habakkuk is speaking about the law of Moses, of course, the law of God. He's speaking about the Torah, and it has grown cold. People have quit seeking guidance from God. They've quit looking to the Lord. in order to learn how to live upright. Along with that, justice is never upheld, he says. Why? Because wickedness is around the righteous. Wickedness is stronger, it seems, than righteousness is. And therefore Habakkuk prays, and he says, justice has come out perverted. And this word perverted means crazy. It means confused. Justice or judgment or rightness is crazy. It's confused. It's perverted. Don't let anyone ever try to persuade you that the Bible is not relevant. I mean, that description right there sounds like it's talking about 21st century America, right? That's mainstream America right there, as well as Washington, D.C. So what do you do? What do you do when you question God's justice? As Habakkuk does here in the first 4 verses, you go to God in prayer. Go talk to God. Abraham argues, you might say, with God in Genesis chapter 18. Moses argues, you might say, with God in Exodus chapter 33. Job spends most of his book arguing with God, challenging God's sense of justice, wanting to speak with God face to face. Many of the Psalms written by David and others are asking God the same question, "O Lord, how long will you not answer my prayer?" So what do you do when you question the justice of God? Verses 1 through 4, you pray to God. Verses 5 through 11, you listen to God. Verses 5 through 11, the speaker in this paragraph, verses 5 through 11, is not Habakkuk. The speaker in this paragraph is God. Now, God sees this, or Habakkuk rather sees this vision. He has this oracle, this burden, and it is in the presence of God that he sees this vision, and he has the opportunity to negotiate, so to speak, with God. And so now God is speaking in verse 11. God says to Habakkuk, "Look among the nations, observe, be astonished, wonder, because I am doing something in your days you would not believe if you were told." Now the verbs here, the commands here, look, observe, and so forth, these are all plural verbs. So God is not speaking just to Habakkuk, He's speaking to all of the nation of Israel, or at least all of those who have the same heart and mind as Habakkuk, who find the situation disturbing as Habakkuk does. And so God calls on Habakkuk and the faithful to look out among the nations, the Gentile nations, and observe what is going on. Notice, pay attention, think about what is going on. Be astonished, and that verb can be translated, be horrified. Something is going on. Something that is strange. Something that is weird. Something that is crazy. God says to Habakkuk, I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe if you were told. Habakkuk, if I were to tell you what I am doing, you would not believe it if I drew you a picture. Do you really want to know what's in your future? Do we really want to know what's going to be happening 6 months from now, a year from now, 6 years from now? I don't know. You'd have to know what it is before you know if you want to know about it, right? Listen to God. What does God say in this verse? He says, number one, in verse 5, that He's actively working. Even if Habakkuk does not see God working, at least in some way, we would not understand what God is doing in our lives behind the scenes, even if He were to tell us what He's doing. Here in the life of Habakkuk, what is God doing? Well, God's going to go ahead and tell Habakkuk what He's going to do. And Habakkuk is not going to like it. Verse 6. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that fierce and impetuous people who march throughout the earth to seize dwelling places which are not theirs. God says, I am raising up the Chaldeans. Well, who are the Chaldeans? Habakkuk knew who they were. Who were they? Chaldea was the name of that area just to the east of the Persian Gulf. And it was that region that eventually gave its name to the peoples in that area, which eventually came to be used as a synonym for the nation of Babylon. So God is talking about the invasion of the nation of Babylon itself. Now we have an idea of what is going on and why Habakkuk is not going to like it. Incidentally, in Swartz Creek right now, I started 3 weeks ago studying the intertestamental period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. You know, there's 400-year period there. And I'm studying with the class now what happened during that 400-year period. You've got the Babylonians now, and then after that the Persians, and then the Greeks, and then the Romans. How did all of that interplay on the world stage affect God's people? It's a very fascinating study. If you've never studied that, I would encourage you to do it. Here in this verse, God says the Chaldeans are that fierce people, that impetuous people. And God says they are marching, they're going back and forth throughout the earth, and they are seizing dwelling places that are not theirs, okay? And that's not good. But please observe here that God says He is the one who's raising up the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans are tools in God's hands to accomplish what God wants to accomplish. And these dwelling places that He refers to here might not just be people's homes. It might also include, and probably does include, the dwelling place of their gods, the place where people worship, the temples where the gods were worshipped. And in doing that, the Chaldeans would be proving to themselves, at least, and to others, that the people of the Babylonians are stronger and more powerful than the gods of the peoples that they're invading. Well, in the mind of the Babylonians, when they invade Jerusalem and they destroy the temple in Jerusalem, then that means their gods, Marduk, for example, is more powerful than the God of the Israelites. Well, God's not going to let that stand. But we'll go on in verse 7. God says, they are dreaded and feared. Their justice and authority originate with themselves. People dread and fear the Chaldeans. Why? Because justice and authority are defined by the Chaldeans. Habakkuk's people, the Israelites, they were crying out that there is no justice. Why? Because people were not submitting to the justice of God. But now God says He's going to raise up a people, the Chaldeans, He says, who make their own definition of justice. You think things are bad, you just wait till the Babylonians invade. Verse 8. Their horses are swifter than leopards and keener than wolves in the evening. Their horsemen come galloping. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swooping down to devour. These thoughts, of course, describe the Chaldean military. In that age, to utilize war horses in battle was state-of-the-art military. The Israelites never were really a cavalry-based military. The Chaldeans were horses and chariots. Chariots was state-of-the-art military equipment at the time. No wonder they were dreaded and feared, especially by that small nation of Israel that was about the size of the state of New Jersey. Verse 9. All of them come for violence. The horde of faces move forward. They collect captives like sand. Once again, Habakkuk uses the word violence, but this describes the Chaldeans. They are coming for violence. Their hordes are moving forward, and they're collecting captives across the land like sand. Verse 10. They mock at kings, and rulers are a laughing matter to them. They laugh at every fortress and heap up rubble to capture it. The Babylonians mock at kings. Why? Because nobody's going to stop them. They have become the dominant force in the Mediterranean world. They were the most fierce army at that time. Rulers in general are a laughing matter to the Babylonians. The Chaldeans laugh at every fortress. Why? Because it's not going to stop them. Heaping up rubble in the text refers to the idea that armies would accumulate debris from other villages, dirt, chop down trees, or whatever, in order to build a mound across the wall so that they could penetrate into a city. In other words, no one is going to stop the Babylonians. Verse 11. Then they will sweep through like the wind and pass on, but they will be held guilty, they whose strength is their God. In this verse of God's first message to Habakkuk, God says that the Babylonians will sweep through like the wind, and they will pass on to their next battle and their next victory. In other words, Jerusalem is going to be only a speed bump and the Babylonians march across the earth. And in fact, the reason why the land of Israel, Palestine, was invaded so frequently is because everybody in the north wanted Egypt. They wanted that fertile land at the mouth of the Nile River. They wanted the wealth of the land of Egypt, and Israel just happened to be in the way. That's why they were invaded by the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Persians. Nobody wanted Israel. They wanted Egypt. Israel was just the doormats. Please observe here that God says they will be held guilty. They whose strength is their God. Like so many people throughout the years, including many, many people in our own country, the Babylonians worship power. They worship strength. But God says He will hold them guilty. In other words, regardless of how powerful and how much the Babylonians conquer, God is not going to let them get away with their wickedness. He will hold them accountable. So what do you do when you question God's justice? What do you do when your understanding of justice collides with your understanding of the nature of God? First of all, you pray to God, verses 1 through 4. Second of all, you listen to God, verses 5 through 11. And here God says, number one, that He is in fact working behind the scenes. And number two, He says what God is actually doing may astound you if you actually knew. Do you really want to know what lies in your future? For Israel, it was a bloody battle with the Babylonians. And their sanctuary, their dwelling place, was going to fall. The temple in Jerusalem would fall just like everybody else's temples. So what do you do when you question the justice of God? Third, in this chapter, you meditate on God's nature. Habakkuk starts speaking again in verse 12, and he responds now to God's message. So verse 12 begins Habakkuk's response to God. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We will not die. You, O Lord, have appointed them to judge, and you, O Rock, have established them to correct. Habakkuk speaks of God's nature here. Habakkuk does not like God's message. It scares him. And it doesn't seem to be any better than what Habakkuk has already portrayed to God in verses 2 through 4. God, what you say is coming and it isn't any better than what we're already experiencing. It's going to get worse. And so about God's nature, verse 12, God is everlasting. That word translated everlasting means from antiquity. In other words, Habakkuk recognizes that God has always been there. It would be similar to a human being today speaking to another human being, an older person, and he says, you know, you've been around for a long time. You've seen things come and go. What do you think? And that's kind of what Habakkuk is saying here. God, you have been forever. And you are my Lord, he says. You are my God. You are my Holy One. We observe here that despite Habakkuk's confusion and despite his painful prayer that he is saying to God here, he still acknowledges that God is his God. Your translation might translate my the 3 times here. You are my Lord. You are my God. You are my Holy One. Just like Job, when he dealt with his problems, Habakkuk here never turns his back on God. He questions God. He doubts God's workings, God's justice perhaps, but he never turns his back on God. It is very disappointing in our time when some people, even Christians, when tragedy happens to them, a child is taken from them, they wind up turning their back on God. That's the last thing we need to do, is turn our back on God. And calling God his Holy One Habakkuk here recognizes that God is holy, and God cannot do anything that is unholy. It is outside of the nature of God to do something that is unholy. Just like it's outside of the nature of God, 1 John 4 and verse 8, to do something that is unloving. Whatever God does, and I don't always understand what He does, He never does something that is unholy or unloving. And so if we perceive that God is doing something that's unholy or unloving, we've got to change our perception. We don't understand everything. That's God's message to Job, wasn't it? Job, you don't understand. God is holy, and He can never do an unholy thing. Now Habakkuk says, we will not die. I doubt Habakkuk was speaking specifically and individually, that no individual Israelite will die when Babylon invades. I doubt that's what he's saying. I suspect he means more that the nation of Israel as a whole will not die. Because Habakkuk knew of the promise that God made to Abraham. Habakkuk recognizes that God has made the Babylonians the judges of Israel. That was God's plan. Even if it was reluctant, Habakkuk recognizes that God has set the Babylonians to be the judges of Israel. But here in verse 12, God is Habakkuk's rock. He would. He had to trust God. But God does not change. God is stable. God is faithful. God is dependable. God is a rock. That word rock is one of the oldest metaphors that is used for God. Way back in the words of Moses, Deuteronomy chapter 33, maybe chapter 34. Verse 13, your eyes are too pure to approve evil, and you cannot look on wickedness with favor. Why do you look with favor on those who deal treacherously? Why are you silent when the wicked swallow up those more righteous than they? Elaborating on God's holiness, Habakkuk says that God cannot look on evil. He has pure eyes to look on evil, Habakkuk said. And so if Satan is standing in the presence of God, as we see in Job chapters 1 and 2, then we must understand Habakkuk here to say, as the New American Standard translates it, that God cannot look with approval on evil. In other words, God cannot approve of wickedness. God cannot approve of evil. But to punish is not evil. If I beat and punch and slap one of my daughters out of anger or frustration, then I have sinned against her. But if I spank her on the bottom, which I haven't done in quite a while, she's 16 years old, motivated out of a love to correct self-destructive behavior, then I am disciplining her as God would have me to do. God is going to punish His people. Motivated out of love to correct them from self-destructive behavior. And that's not wrong. That's not sinful. Habakkuk recognizes here that it is not possible for God to sin. He cannot look on wickedness. And again, we should understand Habakkuk to mean, as the New American Standard adds, with favor. God does not look on wickedness with favor. Now, if that is the case, then Habakkuk asks, how in the world could God favor those who deal treacherously? If God is holy, He cannot approve of evil, then how in the world can God remain silent while the wicked, the Babylonians, swallow up those who are more righteous, the Israelites, than Babylon? If God is holy, how can He use atheists, pagans, to punish godly people? Or at least people who are more godly than the Babylonians. You see, you and I are not the first people to question the justice of God. We are not the first to question the ways of God on earth. Abraham did. Moses did. Job did. Some of the psalmists did. Habakkuk is doing it here. Jeremiah will do it. How can we reconcile the nature of God with our perception of God's behavior? Habakkuk continues, verse 14. Why have you made men like the fish of the sea, like creeping things without a ruler over them? Why, God, have you made humans like animals who can't rule ourselves? Have you ever asked that? Why, God, why have you made humans like animals? In the sense that it doesn't seem like we can control ourselves. Why has God made human beings the way He did? Well, we're not the first to ask that question. Habakkuk does here. Verse 15, Habakkuk says, the Chaldeans bring all of them up with a hook, drag them away with their net, and gather them together in their fishing net. Therefore they rejoice and are glad. God, do you really know what you are doing? Here's how the Babylonians are going to act. They lead people with a hook. They drag them away with a net. They collect them together as with a fishing net, and they boast, they rejoice, they're glad at their treatment of other people. Yes, in ancient times, prisoners of war were often led by putting a hook in their bottom lip or through their nose. Well, it's not likely you're going to pull against that. And the slaves are chained together from one hook to the next. And so we see here pictured that very thing. Does God really know what He's doing? Verse 16. Therefore they offer a sacrifice to their net and burn incense to their fishing net, because through these things their catch is large and their food is plentiful. What does it mean that the Babylonians sacrifice to their nets? I understand Habakkuk to mean that because of their success in capturing other peoples with their net, which he refers to in verse 15, then they're going to sacrifice to their gods, thanking their gods for giving them success in their battles. The same idea is behind burning incense to their fishing net, worshiping their gods because of the success they have had with their fishing nets. The Babylonians' catch is large, and their food is plentiful. That idea, those words are metaphors, of course, for the Babylonians capturing all these people, including the Israelites. And so, verse 17, will they therefore empty their net and continually slay nations without sparing? That question just hangs there, waiting for God to answer. Is Babylon ever going to stop? Will they stop with Assyria? Will they stop with Israel? Will they stop when they get to Egypt? Who's going to stop the Babylonians? What do you do, family, when you question God's justice? You meditate on God's nature. Yes, God is holy. God is perfect. God cannot approve of wickedness. But God is working behind the scenes. We do not see or understand all that God is doing. We're going to end our study of chapter 1 here at this point. We are going to come back shortly, and we're going to pick up with chapter 2. And in chapters 2 and chapter 3, we're going to see this conversation going on between God and Habakkuk about this concept of perverted justice. This idea that God is not ruling in this world in a fair and equitable way. God has a response to Habakkuk. We will say this at this particular time: if we argue that God needs to behave fairly, and there are a lot of people who reject the idea that God exists because they can't reconcile the existence of God with the existence of evil. Because of all the suffering in this world, there cannot be a God. Because of the way my wife suffered with cancer, the way my grandmother suffered, God, there can't be a God for that. And there's a lot of people who reject the idea of God for that. But to say that means that there has to be a standard of fairness by which we are judging God, that He is not measuring up to that standard. But then what is that standard? What is that standard of fairness by which we can judge God, if not by God's own nature? That's the only thing by which we can judge right and wrong, is by God's own nature. So what this boils down to is that we simply do not know how God is operating in the world. We don't know how God is operating in our own lives. But as with Habakkuk, we simply have to trust God to do the fair and right thing. What do you do when you question? What do you do when you question God's justice? Habakkuk has told us here in chapter 1, you pray to God. You go talk to God. And in fact, if you read the book of Psalms from this perspective, you will see often that in the book of Psalms, the writers, David and others, lay their raw emotions at the throne of God, even up to and including asking God to knock the teeth out of their enemies. You and I probably would find it hard to pray that kind of prayer. And yet I've told people, if you feel that way, talk to God about it. God is big enough to handle those kind of emotions. But then we have to let God deal with it. Let God work in His own way. So talk to God in prayer. Listen to His Word. I have a Bible study going on right now with a young lady who's a Christian and her fiancé. Fiancé doesn't have any background in any church. And after the goal of this study is to convert him, and then we're going to go into premarital counseling. And so I'm commending them for wanting to get things right. Their marriage started off on the right foot. But we're talking about communication. When we talk about communication in the marriage relationship, in order to have a healthy relationship, right, you got to have good communication. And I said, now, in order to have a good relationship with God, you also have to have communication. So we pray to God, but then we have to listen to God, right? So this is God talking to us. Now, you may have talked to a lot of people who say they don't come to church like they should. God is not in the center of their lives like He ought to be. But they say, well, I pray to God all the time. And my response usually is, well, you're talking to God, but are you listening to God? Sounds very arrogant to me. I'll talk to God and expect Him to listen to me, but I'm not going to listen to Him. So we pray, but we also listen. Listen to what God has to say. So we've got to have our feet grounded in His Word. And then third, as we've seen, we meditate on His nature. Meditate on the nature of God, because God's nature does not change. Before we take a break and come back for chapter 2, anybody have any thoughts, comments, questions on this study, this text? All right, well, we'll take our break. Eat another donut, another cup of coffee.